All right, so is Elle Kennedy's The Charlie Method worth your time? Our expert critic has some strong opinions and, spoiler alert, it's not the glowing five-star romance some might expect.
Yeah, that's right. The Charlie Method is sparking some pretty heated debates, especially among diehard Elle Kennedy readers. My personal take, let's just say I'm not rushing to add this one to my favorites shelf.
Ooh, okay, that's already got me intrigued. So for our listeners who haven't cracked open this book yet, tell us, what kind of romance fan should be paying attention to this deep dive?
This one is definitely for fans of Kennedy's Off-Campus and Briar U series. It's set in that same world with cameos from familiar characters and a continuation of all those inside jokes that readers love. Think of it as like a return trip to Briar U with all the steamy romance you'd expect from Elle Kennedy.
Okay, a must-read for Briar U fans, got it. But we're here to dissect the good, the bad, and the controversial. What's the overall promise of this deep dive? What can our listeners expect to learn?
We're going to break down the writing, the characters, that infamous punch scene everyone's talking about, and of course, that sizzling MFM dynamic. By the end of this, you'll know exactly whether the Charlie Method deserves a spot on your reading list or if you should pass and stick with Kennedy's earlier works.
Love it.
Yeah.
Okay, so you mentioned strong opinions and a less than stellar rating. Can you give us the full verdict up front? How many stars are we talking here?
I'm giving it a 3 out of 5. It's not a bad book by any means, but it doesn't quite reach the heights of Kennedy's previous work, in my opinion, and it seems I'm not alone in that. The Goodreads reviews are all over the place, which is unusual for a Kennedy novel. Some loved it, but many felt it was a bit of a misstep, particularly in how the throuple dynamic played out.
3 stars. Okay, color me intrigued, but also a bit cautious. I'm a huge fan of Kennedy's Off-Campus series, so this is making me wonder if the Charlie Method is a spin-off I can skip. Before we dive into those divisive reviews, let's meet the main players. Who is this Charlie, and what kind of trouble is she getting into?
Our leading lady is Charlotte, or Charlie when she's letting loose. She's the seemingly perfect sorority girl on the surface, a STEM major, super organized, always striving to please. But underneath, she's got this wild side, a need for speed, and a desire to explore her sexuality. And explore, she does enter Will and Beckett.
Okay, a sorority girl with a secret wild side. Classic Elle Kennedy setup. Tell us more about these guys. Why are they the perfect partners for Charlie's exploration?
Will, who readers might remember from the Briar U series, is your classic charming hockey player, but he's also dealing with a controlling father who wants to dictate his entire life. Then there's Beckett, the laid-back Aussie with a hidden sensitive side, thanks to some past heartbreak. And here's where things get spicy. All 3 of them have been anonymously chatting on a dating app, leading to some seriously steamy encounters.
Whoa, secret dating app and a throuple dynamic. Sounds like Kennedy cranked up the heat on this one. But you mentioned some mixed reactions. What were the main criticisms? Did this throuple actually work?
That's the thing. While the premise is super steamy, the execution left some readers feeling a bit cold. Many felt the MFM aspect was underdeveloped, with more focus on Charlie's individual relationships with Will and Beckett rather than a true exploration of the 3 of them as a unit.
Ah, so it's more like 2 separate romances happening at the same time, rather than a genuine throuple with its own unique dynamic.
That's a good point, and something I'm always wary of with MFM romances. Did the book address this criticism at all?
It touches upon Will and Beckett's friendship and their history of sharing partners, but some readers felt it didn't go deep enough, especially given their established closeness in the previous Briar U books. For me, it felt like a missed opportunity to delve into the complexities of a truly balanced and fulfilling throuple.
I see. So the lack of a strong Will and Beckett connection might disappoint fans who were hoping for more of their dynamic. That makes sense. Now, I know Elle Kennedy is known for her witty dialogue and fast-paced plots, but you mentioned pacing issues with this book. Can you elaborate on that? Some sections felt a bit drawn out, particularly Charlie's internal struggle with her dual identity and her search for her biological family. Now, this subplot adds depth to her character, but some readers, myself included, found it distracting from the main romance. It's almost like 2 separate stories vying for attention.
2 storylines battling it out, huh? That's something I've noticed in other romance novels, and it can be frustrating when one overshadows the other. Did the book manage to weave these 2 threads together in a satisfying way, or did it feel disjointed?
That's where the critiques come in. Some felt it lacked that seamless integration, leading to a somewhat uneven reading experience. They wanted more of that steamy romance and less focus on the adoption storyline, which, while important, didn't feel as tightly woven into the central plot. It's like ordering a double chocolate fudge sundae and getting a side of steamed broccoli. It's not bad, it just doesn't quite fit.
I love that analogy. The steamed broccoli of subplots. Okay, so we've got pacing issues, a potentially underdeveloped throuple dynamic, and a side plot that might not be everyone's cup of tea. But what about the writing itself? Is it still that signature Elle Kennedy style that fans adore?
The writing is definitely recognizable as Elle Kennedy. You've got those witty banter, those steamy scenes, and those moments that make you laugh out loud. But even some of the most die-hard fans felt the character development, especially for the guys, was lacking in this one.
Ah, so even the humor and steam couldn't quite save the characters. What was missing, specifically? Were Will and Beckett just not as captivating as the heroes in her other books?
It's not that they were completely flat, but compared to characters like Garrett Graham or Logan Hunt, they felt a bit one-dimensional. Will, especially, seems sidelined in the throuple dynamic. Some readers felt he was almost an afterthought, which is surprising considering he's a fan favorite from the Briar U series.
Sidelined even with all that steamy action. I'm curious, how did that play out in the story? Did he have fewer scenes, less dialogue, or something like that?
Yeah, one reader actually pointed out that Will had significantly fewer chapters from his point of view compared to Charlie and Beckett. It almost felt like he was there to facilitate the MFM dynamic rather than be a fully fleshed out character with his own desires and motivations. And then there's that infamous scene where Beckett punches him.
Wait, hold up. Beckett punches Will. That seems intense. And out of character for a laid-back Aussie, wouldn't you say? What was the context there?
Yeah, it happens when Will decides not to go to Sydney with Charlie and Beckett, which creates tension between him and Beckett. Many readers felt it was a completely unnecessary scene, like a tired trope that added nothing to the plot and felt jarringly out of place in a contemporary romance.
Yeah, a physical fight doesn't exactly scream healthy relationship, especially when you're trying to establish a balanced throuple dynamic.
Yeah.
Did the book address this or offer any justification for Beckett's actions?
Not really. It's brushed over fairly quickly, and while Beckett eventually apologizes, the scene left many readers feeling uncomfortable and questioning the power dynamics within the throuple. And for some, it highlighted that lack of balance we were talking about earlier, with Will seemingly taking a backseat to both Charlie and Beckett.
So not only is Will sidelined in terms of character development, but he also ends up on the receiving end of a punch. Ouch. Okay, this is making me rethink whether I want to pick up this book at all. But before I completely write it off, let's touch on the world-building aspect.
Yeah.
You mentioned this book is firmly set in the Briar U world. How does that play out, and is it enjoyable for readers who are already familiar with Kennedy's other series?
It's definitely a treat for those fans. You get cameos from beloved characters like the off-campus guys, the hilarious dad chat continues, and there are even hints about future storylines for other Briar U couples. It's like a reunion for all your favorite characters.
Okay, so the Briar U element could be a major selling point for existing fans. What about readers who are new to Kennedy's work? Would you recommend this as a starting point, or would they feel lost without the backstory?
I'd definitely recommend starting with either the off-campus or Briar U series first. While the Charlie method technically stands on its own, you'll miss out on all those inside jokes, those character connections, and that overall sense of familiarity that adds to the enjoyment.
So existing fans get a fun reunion, but newcomers might want to start elsewhere. Got it. Now, there was one detail about this book that really caught my attention. Charlie writes fan fiction. Tell me more. Is it as quirky and hilarious as it sounds?
It's definitely a unique element. Charlie writes fan fiction about historical figures like Queen Elizabeth I and Alexander the Great. Some readers loved it, finding it hilarious and endearing, but others found it random and distracting, taking away from the main romance plot.
Historical fan fiction.
I don't know.
I can see how that could be a hit or miss element. Did the book explain why Charlie's drawn to this particular type of fan fiction?
Yeah.
Did it connect to her character in any meaningful way, or was it just a random quirk?
Honestly, it felt more like a quirky detail than a fully integrated aspect of her character. It provided some comedic moments, but it didn't really add any depth to her personality or her journey.
Okay, so maybe a missed opportunity to explore a potentially fascinating part of Charlie's inner world. So far, we've covered a lot of ground, some hits, some misses, and a few elements that left readers scratching their heads. But let's be real, the million-dollar question for many romance fans is the steam actually good?
This is Elle Kennedy we're talking about. So yes, the steam is definitely there. It's hot, it's explicit, and it's definitely a highlight of the book. But even in that department, there were some complaints. Specifically, that the aspect of the MFM dynamic was lacking. So if you're hoping for some steamy Will and Beckett action, you might be disappointed.
Ah, the age-old issue with MFM romances. Sometimes the MM connection gets shortchanged. So if the steam is primarily focused on Charlie's individual relationships with the guys, what kind of reader would truly enjoy this book?
If you're looking for a light escapist read with some spice, and you're not too concerned about a deeply developed throuple dynamic or complex character arcs, you might find this enjoyable. Think of it as a beach read with a unique twist.
So a fun distraction, but maybe not a book that will stay with you long after you finish it. Makes sense. Now we've established that this book might not be for everyone. But let's be brutally honest, who should absolutely skip this book? What kind of reader would be throwing it across the room in frustration?
Exactly. It's like that guilty pleasure song you enjoy, but wouldn't necessarily add to your all-time favorites playlist.
I like that analogy. So for those who are still intrigued, despite its flaws, what's the best way to approach this book?
Go in with the right expectations. If you're craving a light, steamy read set in a familiar world with characters you might already adore, you'll probably enjoy it. But if you're looking for a deeply nuanced exploration of polyamory or characters who undergo significant growth, you might be left wanting more.
It's all about setting those realistic expectations, right? Knowing what you're getting into can make all the difference in your reading experience. Now, you mentioned other authors who handle MFM dynamics really well. Any specific recommendations for our listeners who are looking for a more satisfying dive into that particular trope?
Absolutely. If you're looking for books with strong MFM dynamics that delve a bit deeper into the emotional and logistical complexities of those relationships, I highly recommend checking out authors like Lauren Donner and Katie Robert. They both write incredibly steamy romances with compelling characters and well-developed relationships.
Fantastic suggestions. I'll definitely add those to my ever-growing TBR pile. But for those who are still curious about the Charlie method, despite its flaws, any final words of wisdom?
Embrace it for what it is. A fun escapist read with a unique dynamic. Don't expect it to change your life or challenge your perspectives, but if you're in the mood for something light and spicy, it might just hit the spot.
Perfect. So if you're looking for a quick, steamy escape with some familiar faces and a touch of Briar U magic, the Charlie method might be worth a shot. But if you're seeking something more substantial, there are plenty of other options out there waiting to be discovered.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And as always, the best way to know for sure is to take the plunge and form your own opinion.
That's the beauty of reading. It's a personal journey, and what works for one person might not work for another. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the Charlie method. We hope we've given you enough information to decide whether this book deserves a spot on your TBR pile. Until next time, happy reading.